Good morning, Metalheads Unit. Welcome to a new episode of the Metal Meltdown. And today we are looking at the official studio debut album from Cerebral Rot, entitled Odious Descent into Decay. 2019 has been fucking stellar for death metal, all across the board. It's been a really great year for death metal, you know? The underground scene is fucking booming, with 20 Buck Spin in particular putting out killer record after killer record from the likes of Fetid, Superstition, Immortal Bird, My Hometown Heroes 2 Mold as well. It has been an extremely stacked year. It's getting to the point where almost every week there's a seriously killer death metal album that I need to check out one way or another. For that reason, it's also going to be more and more difficult in the future for new death metal bands to stand out, so they're going to have to start doing some really funky things. They're going to have to really start digging in deep and getting creative and getting weird and getting heavier and darker. And that's where Cerebral Rot come in. I've heard a lot about this band, even amongst all the other death metal records I reviewed so far this summer. One of the bands that keeps popping up in my recommendeds, one of the albums that people keep telling me about, is this debut album from Cerebral Rot. As far as I can tell, they've definitely already made an impact on the underground death metal scene right now. I mean, for fuck's sakes, yet another band out of 20 Buck Spin. Y'all motherfuckers never quit. It's insane. And as such, an album that I may have normally saved for an Albums I Missed video suddenly piqued my curiosity a little bit more than some of the other death metal records from my way, and I decided to make a point out of singling this one out, to figure out why exactly it's making the entirety of the death metal world lose their fucking minds right now. The answer, as it turns out, is remarkably simple, perhaps so simple that I should have known ahead of time, if we're being honest. People love this because it's fucking gross. I don't mean that in a good or bad way. I mean that objectively. This album is fucking gross. The guitars are swampy, thick, covered in static and electronic snarl. The drums are loud and have this huge old school death metal vibe to them, reminiscent of the legendary Scott Burns death metal sound. But not quite old school death metal. It still feels relatively modern in some aspects, relatively gruesome. It also reminds me of a lot of modern brutal death metal, particularly in those nasty fucking vocals. It sounds like this man is quite literally vomiting into his microphone. And that objective grossness isn't just in the band's musical DNA, it's also found in the general aesthetic of the record. Take, for instance, the album cover. That literally looks like snot and shit and tar mixed in a fucking blender and thrown on a goddamn canvas. It is so gross to just look at. There's a level of unabashed but also kind of tongue-in-cheek brutality that reminds me a lot of the very first Carcass record, Reek of Putrefaction. And I'm sure that's intentional considering some of the song titles. Take, for instance, Swamped in Festering Excrementia. Ew. Or perhaps my favorite title, and probably the best death metal song title I've heard all fucking year, may I add, Primordial Soup of Radioactive Sewage. That's fucking great. And if I may begin to segue into my actual opinion of the record, I'd like to say that that title, Primordial Soup of Radioactive Sewage, also acts as a really great description as to what this album is like. Listening to this record is kind of like walking through a primordial soup of radioactive sewage. This is not an album that the average person can casually listen to, not because it's bad, but again, just because it is so objectively gross. This is going to turn people off right away. Hell, I'm not gonna lie, it turned me off a little bit. Not so much because it was gross, mind you, more so because initially I had this mentality of, great, another underground death metal record that sounds brutal and gross and weird. Okay, throw that in the pile, whatever. To people who act on that former point, I can't really blame you. This isn't for everyone. Death metal, frankly, isn't for everyone, so this certainly isn't. But in regards to that latter point, people who choose to dismiss this as yet another slab of underground death metal, you're not entirely wrong, but simply dismissing it because of that is kind of foolish, because yes, while this is still somewhat generic, at least as far as the formula and the songwriting is concerned, it is a legitimately fun record. And it has a lot to do with how objectively kind of gross it is. There is legitimately some almost comedic value into how fucked up the songwriting and the lyrics are on this, into the gross aesthetic of the entire record. There's an almost horror movie kind of campiness to the whole thing that makes it impossible not to enjoy on the most basic level, even when you have an extremely juvenile song like Swamped in Festering Excrementia. And no, I'm not exaggerating when I say juvenile, because this song is essentially about drowning in fucking shit. It helps that the music bolsters a lot of this as well. I mean, the drums sound great across the record, the guitars sound great across the record, vocals are great, or rather fitting across the record. This is not personally my preferable vocal style, but I won't deny it fits in pretty nicely and adds to the atmosphere of the record. Cerebral Rot very wisely take advantage of a lot of tempo changes to throw you off guard from time to time. Take, for instance, some really doomy passages that can be found in Sardonic Repentance on the title track, Odious Descent into Decay. These moments actually feel quite jarring and uncomfortable as these doomy passages lumber around and contrast with the incredibly gross atmosphere that Cerebral Rot have worked so hard to construct, making this feel all the more devastating and powerful, even when realistically it's a pretty simple little formula that they've devised here. Other songs like Putrefaction, Eternal Decay rely on good old-fashioned fucking death metal carnage with buzzsaw riffs on par with modern Cannibal Corpse, but applied to a much more brutal death metal kind of aesthetic. Other songs like Repulsive Infestation of Cadaver and the reviled Swamped in Festering Excrementia at this point also take advantage of a very similar kind of death metal carnage, but also have a lot of really slick bass grooves thrown into the mix, and they're very subtle, but they do kind of catch you off guard if you are paying attention, and they just create these really great headbanging moments. These are songs that are definitely going to inspire some fucking mosh pits in a live setting. All in all, the record does kind of get by on being very violent and grotesque, as it's not the most original record in the world, not strictly as far as songwriting is concerned, but as I've noted, Cerebral Rot have a lot of little tricks that they throw into the mix to even things up, to keep you on your toes, to keep you excited, to keep you guessing, and even if those work, there's still so much to love about the incredibly gross, gnarly atmosphere and soundscape that Cerebral Rot have constructed here. So I'm going to give this an insanely enthusiastic 3.5 out of 5. Not quite feeling that 4 for me personally, but I think if you were an avid death metal fan, this is another record that you need to fucking have. I would struggle to imagine that a really fucking diehard death metal fan would not enjoy this record. On the flip side, however, I should point out that this is kind of difficult to recommend to virtually anyone else. This isn't an album you're going to be whipping out at parties. This isn't an album that you're going to be showing to people who want to get interested in heavy metal. It just isn't. It is, as I've noted, objectively so fucking gross. And it's going to turn a lot of people off right away. To be entirely frank, if nothing I've said intrigues you even the slightest, just don't listen to this album. I mean, I really don't think there's anything I could say to convince you otherwise, so just don't check it out. Just don't. But for everyone else, if you're looking for an incredibly morbid, but also still kind of silly death metal album with lots of killer riffs and lots of gross shit, you can't go wrong with this record whatsoever. 3.5 out of 5. Really impressed with this. Very curious to hear more from Cerebral Rot in the future. And that is it for the Metal Meltdown. I'm not an expert, nor do I claim to be, so what do you think? Do you like this record? Do you not like this record? And what do you want to hear from me next? And thank you for watching. Make sure you press subscribe so you get updates on the Metal Meltdown fucking immediately, and you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.